What happens to people who work in manufacturing when their work disappears? Farah Stockman will join us to talk about her new book, American Made. How do you turn the history of physics into gripping fiction? Benjamin Labatut joins us to talk about his new book, When We Cease to Understand the World. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 22nd. I'm Pamela Paul. Farah Stockman joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is a member of the editorial board at the New York Times and the author of a new book, American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears. Farah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
So you're my colleague at the New York Times, and yet we've never met. Full disclosure, we've never encountered one another. And you also have one of those jobs where our work really doesn't intersect, except when you write a book. Explain to us, if you would, what it means to be on the editorial board of the New York Times, and how did you get there? Because you've been at the Times for a while.
Yeah, good question. We write editorials, which is unsigned pieces that represent the paper's views on any number of things. I specialize in foreign policy. We also are starting to write signed editorials more, which are essentially like columns that express our own personal views on things. So we're still journalists, we still report, but we get to have an opinion in areas that reporters would have to keep their opinion under wraps. And I used to work at the editorial page at the Boston Globe. I spent most of my career at the Boston Globe, and Katie Kingsbury was an editor there. And when she moved over to the Times, she eventually convinced me to come over. I had been on the national desk covering national stories before, which is when I started writing this book.
Do you miss straight out reporting where your opinion isn't part of the formula, the mixture?
Yes and no. I mean, I still report. My opinion isn't worth much if it's not backed by facts and real people. So I spend a lot of time trying to talk to people and trying to report out a story. And then I just take one more step to say, okay, what should we do about this? And is there a solution, which normal reporters wouldn't necessarily have to do?
So when you think about the editorial board, you think, or at least I think, because I have like old timey, I'm sure outdated images in my head, and maybe other people have similar ones, of a group of people who spent many decades working as journalists and all assembling very seriously, all wearing serious suits in a big boardroom around a large table and deliberating on various matters. Is that really what it's like? Or is that, I mean, obviously it's not like that in quarantine.
Yeah, now we're wearing yoga pants and we're on Zoom. So yes, exactly. No, I mean, our board is has some younger members. There's an attempt to get new and younger people on it, but yeah, you sit around and talk, and that at its best, you debate.
What does a typical day look like as a member of the editorial board for you?
I tend to write about foreign policy, so I look at what's being written around the world and what are the flashpoints that we're seeing come up. And you can never write about everything that deserves attention. There's just not enough space in anyone's brain to do it if you have the entire world. So you really have to pick and choose what's important, and that's hard.
So I've spent a little bit of time talking about your work, but I feel like it's thematically in line with this book, which is about work and as your subtitle says, what happens to people when work disappears. Tell us just briefly what you were trying to do with this book, American Made. What was the originating idea?
I wrote this book because, like many of your listeners, I was stunned when Donald Trump won the election in 2016. I was stunned that so many Americans had cast a ballot for a man who had not even served one day in government, and they elected him president. And I'm from Michigan. I'm from the Rust Belt. So I started asking around why. And people kept saying, he's going to save my factory, he's going to save my job. One thing that had been lost on me during the election was how much he emphasized the saving of the factories. At his rallies, he would say, is there anyone here from Carrier, which was a plant that was slated to move to Mexico? And, people in the audience would raise their hands and yell out their number of years of seniority. So he really made people feel heard in a way that a lot of politicians for 30 years had said, look, globalization is coming, it's here, we can't stop it. And so their concerns have been swept under the rug for a long time by both parties, and Trump bucked that. I decided to follow people at a plant in Indiana that was moving to Mexico. It was a plant that Trump had tweeted about. And I wanted to know, like, what did it feel like to be told that your job is moving away because these people over here are going to do it cheaper? So I followed a woman named Shannon Mulcahy for 7 months as the plant shut down. She agonized over whether she should train her Mexican replacement or stand with the union and refuse to train. And I told her story in the New York Times in 2017. People from all over the world wrote in and said, what happened to Shannon? What happened to her? And I should add that one of the reasons people connected with her is one, she was a woman, and two, she had been abused in her relationship, and she had gotten the strength and the money to leave her abuser because of the job in the factory. And she climbed the ranks, and against all odds, she came to be in charge of the factory's furnaces, which were it was one of the most dangerous and highly paid jobs on the factory floor, and it had been dominated by men. No woman had ever been a heat treat operator before. She was a really unique character. She also decided to train her Mexican replacement. She remembered how the men had refused to train her. And she took this kid in her mind, he was the same age as her son, this 25-year-old guy from Mexico, and she taught him about these furnaces even though the union had wanted everybody to refuse to train. And so she got this really deep relationship with this, or she got a bond, a friendship with this Mexican guy. And at the end of the training, he took her aside and put his hand over his heart and kind of tried to apologize for taking her job.
All right, there's so much here, and I want to keep going with Shannon Mulcahy's story, but it sounds like this is one of those books that originated in reporting, post 2016 reporting, in which a number of journalists, including most perhaps of the newsroom at the New York Times, was really caught by surprise by the election of Donald Trump and went back and asked, how did this happen? Who voted for him? Why did they vote for him? So, just to get back to that political question for a moment, for a long time in this country, the working class union members were considered the Democrats' bread and butter. These were the people that you could count on to vote for Democrats. When did that shift? And did it happen with Donald Trump, or did it precede him?
It happened with Bill Clinton. These were blue collar union people who had been Democrats for generations. One guy told me his grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew that he had voted for a Republican. I'll never forget interviewing a steelworker named Tim, who told me that he'd been raised to think of the Democrats as the party of the working man and the Republican, they were the party of the greedy corporations. You didn't vote for those greedy bastards. That's what he told me. And he was so trusting of the Democratic Party. He loved Bill Clinton. And when NAFTA came along, he believed Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton said, this is going to create lots and lots of good paying blue collar jobs. And this is going to stop undocumented Mexicans from coming across the border. He thought Ross Perot, Ross Perot was that third party candidate who talked about NAFTA is going to create a sucking sound of all these jobs going to Mexico. He said that guy is an idiot. Fast forward to 2004, and this guy had worked at a bearing plant that closed down and moved to Shanghai. I should add that it was not just NAFTA that Bill Clinton did, but it was China's entrance into the WTO, which allowed then China to really bring a lot of low cost goods into the United States. And it hit certain areas, it hit certain geographies hard. It really did. Same with NAFTA. the pain was not spread equally throughout the country. Places in Indiana got hurt. And any town in this country that relied on a factory that competed with goods, let's say sneakers or textiles, toys, they just got hammered. And it wasn't just the factory workers, it was the waitresses, it was everybody in the town. So this guy, Tim, said, you know what? Ross Perot was exactly right. He was right. The Democrats got in bed with the Wall Street corporations, and while nobody was looking, and it was a sellout job. That's what he told me. It was a sellout job. And I was sure that he was wrong. I went home and started looking into NAFTA on my computer. I was sure that he would be proven wrong. And yet it, I had to I had to see where he was coming from. If you look at the things Bill Clinton promised, that would come out of NAFTA. Way more blue collar jobs, more jobs created than were lost in America. Mexico will get rich and they'll be able to buy our products. Undocumented immigrants would stop coming across the border and doing these blue collar jobs for cheaper, right? That's what was promised to them. And none of that came to pass. And they were furious at Bill Clinton, and they were never going to vote for Bill Clinton's wife. They were never going to vote for her. And so they backed Bernie Sanders in that union hall. And they had a huge picture of Bernie Sanders, in the central place in their union hall. And when Bernie Sanders didn't win the nomination, they went for Trump. Not all of them, many of them went for Trump. And this particular guy, he just explained it why they felt like they had no party for a long time. They felt like the Democrats had left them for a long time. And then they all just flocked to Trump.
So it sounds like the animating force here really was class, and yet race and gender, you would think, also would play a part in terms of determining their politics. I mean, Shanna Mulcahy, as you've described her, is a kind of trailblazer. Some might think, oh, this is a feminist. And another of the workers you end up concentrating on in the book is Wally, who is a Black bearing assembler, and then John, who's white. So they have other demographic characteristics that you think might determine what their political stance is. But how much does that affect their vote? Let's actually just talk about Shannon first. Did she consider herself a feminist as a woman working in a traditionally male workplace?
This is such a great question because I was like, why, if they're all working the same factory and if globalization and the factory job losses, that's what's motivating them to vote for Trump? Why didn't the Black workers who are working right alongside them vote for Trump? Because they didn't. I didn't find a single Black worker who voted for Trump in that factory. And there were a lot of them. There were a lot of Black workers there.
That's another question which I'd love for you to touch on, which is we often talk about the white working class. We very rarely talk about the Black working class.
And they're in the same factory. The working class is not white. It is very multiracial. And I would put it to you that that factory and many others like it were far more interracial in their working population than the corporations, than the corporate boards that run them. And so, these Black workers and white workers were working side by side. They were on a bowling league together. They would go to Colts games together. They had a lot of interaction, more interaction, in fact, than a lot of the white collar lawyers and doctors that I know here in Boston. And so the way that the working class has been painted as all white and also extremely racist, I feel like some of that is really slander. To get back to your point about did Shannon make the same calculation? Shannon was like exactly the type of person that I would have thought would go for Hillary Clinton as a president, right? But actually, I think everyone around her was really excited about Trump. She actually didn't vote in that election because she really didn't follow politics very well. The only time she had ever voted before in her life was in 2008. She voted for Barack Obama because she got caught up in the excitement of it, she told me. But, she had been raised never to cast a ballot. Her father used to tell her, why vote for one crook over another? They're all crooks. But the summer of 2016, her father had sort of a conversion experience where, his friends start telling him, listen to Donald Trump, listen to this guy. This guy is talking some sense. And Donald Trump was talking about factories moving. Donald Trump was talking about undocumented immigrants coming across the border. And both of those things were things that he had seen and experienced and that hid him in his pocketbook. Her father had a lawn care business, and he was competing with undocumented immigrants who charged less money than him. So her dad gets all into Trump. Shannon wasn't sure. She wasn't sure whether she should get on the Trump train. But after Trump tweeted personally about her factory, she came to think, oh, he cares about me. That tweet gave her a personal feeling the president elect of the United States was thinking about her. And so, even though the factory ended up closing, she kind of didn't hold it against him. At least he was talking about it. At least he's trying. And I came to see her as kind of a political bellwether over the years. I followed her for 4 years.
Tell us about Wally, the Black bearing assembler you wrote about, and what the civil rights and racial justice movement mean to him and to his political and economic interests.
Wally was one of the most optimistic people I have ever met. He had spent a stint in prison as a youth, and so he was really grateful for the job. He was beloved. He was a super hard worker. Everybody loved Wally. And when the plant closed, I met him at a union rally. He gave a fiery speech about interracial solidarity and the need to fight for these jobs. But afterwards, I met him, and he was optimistic. He said, God closed this plant so that I could go out and start my own business. And he really believed it. He believed in the American dream. He wanted to start a barbecue business. I followed him for a year while he tried to start this business. So to him, getting in the factories was really the result of the civil rights movement, and the fact that Black people were finally able to get in these plants and get the good paying union jobs that had been previously denied to them, which is why it's so sad that these factories started moving away right after the civil rights movement, right after Blacks and women were actually able to get these jobs. I ended up following Wally until, I mean, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but until he died. He died within a year of that plant closing because he had chest pains and he didn't go to the hospital because he didn't have insurance anymore. To me, it was like such a gut punch, but it showed how the loss of jobs can be deadly. There was actually 3 people who died within a year of that plant closing of either stress or alcohol related illnesses.
How effective are the unions at protecting and advancing the interests of these manufacturing workers?
I really think we've seen unions in a death spiral. And part of the reason is globalization. You had so many people who fought for these manufacturing jobs to be good paying jobs and decent jobs that you could raise a family on. They didn't used to be, but they were after the labor movement had a long struggle and a long fight. And as soon as we start seeing pensions and healthcare and decent wages, and as soon as Blacks and women start getting that stuff, now factories can move away. They can go to other countries. And it really sort of undercut unions' ability to demand things and to strike. And you saw a lot less appetite among workers for asking for stuff like that because now everybody just has to beg those factories to stay. And now we're throwing money at factories. Please come locate here. And so you're really seeing that workers were back on their heels and they kept having to give up stuff. The union sort of became this forum for deciding which benefit they're going to give up next. And that was not popular. So people started losing faith in the union's ability to actually improve their lives. And one of the things Donald Trump, one of his messages to workers was, I can fix this, but your union can't. I can pick up the phone and make a factory stay in the States by convincing the CEO or by basically removing regulations, getting rid of things like minimum wages and the stuff that was making it expensive to keep a factory in the States. And so, that was his MO. Like, at least you'll have your job. It won't have the same pay. It's not going to have union protections. It's not going to have environmental protections, but you'll have your job. That's kind of the bargain that he sold to them. And a lot of people went for it.
And it's interesting you describe unions as being in a death spiral among the working class, and yet if you work in the media, it seems like unions are having a moment with, at least among college-educated elite media workers, many more workforces becoming unionized. But at the same time, warehouses operated by Amazon have been rejecting unionization. What explains this contradiction?
Well, I think the precariousness of employment is inching up the education chain, right? So now even the college educated don't necessarily get guaranteed a good job anymore. You can have a PhD and you don't have tenure, you're an adjunct and you're being exploited. And so we're seeing a lot of union action and domestic workers, home healthcare aides, those kinds of people, as well as on college campuses. So it is having a revival. I mean, capitalism isn't working for the average worker anymore in a certain way. And so people are trying different stuff to figure out how to make it work. When I talk about the death spiral, I'm talking about unions used to be powerful. And so they used to be able to get stuff for their workers and get politicians elected who would protect the unions. But now in Indiana, you can't get a Democrat elected statewide anymore. So they have right to work and they're passing laws that go against unions, and unions don't have the same money anymore to back the kind of people who are going to actually protect them.
In writing about the American labor force, what's the hardest thing to get across to readers?
Why working class people don't vote for Democrats to get the social safety net that Democrats are offering. People tear out their hair and say, oh, why do they vote against their own interests? And it's like, these people want their jobs. They want their jobs. And to them, getting a government check is a humiliation. The fact that they earned a paycheck is what set them apart from the lower class or from members of their own family who are lazy and don't work. They all knew people who gamed the system and didn't have jobs, and it irked them. We talk a lot now about how we're going to have to move to universal basic income or something like that because of the way that global capitalism is working, and machines are going to start replacing everybody. And some of us are comfortable with talking about that. But when you really look at the working class and talk to some of these people, they don't trust the government. They're not excited about the idea of living off a government check. And to them, that's always been failure. I started to understand the psychology a lot more. We're going to take your factory away, but oh, here's some welfare. That doesn't go over well among a lot of people. That's not what motivates them. It's not what allows them to hold their head up high. And I think we have to start really reconnecting with and listening to them to be able to fix the toxic politics that we are in right now.
Well, there is a lot of insight in this book, so I hope readers will come here to find some of those answers to get that information. The book, again, is called American Made: What Happens to People When Work Disappears by Farah Stockman. Farah, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
This Monday, October 25th, we have a free virtual event for New York Times subscribers as part of our year-long celebration of the book review's 125th anniversary. So, if you haven't already RSVP'd, I hope you'll do that right away. It's full of gems from our archives. The actor Daniel Day Kim and other guests will be reading reviews of now beloved books that we originally panned, some of which, as you'll see, we got very wrong. We'll also be sharing a selection of our favorite angry letters to the editor from decades of submissions, including all the complaints and vexations that literary luminaries have written us over the years. And Tina Jordan, our deputy editor and frequent podcast contributor, will preside over the live book review trivia game. It's going to be a lot of fun, and you can RSVP at nytimes.com/bookreview125. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review. Tina, hey.
Hey, Pamela. So I have a question for you. Are you aware that there is a Romana play about the book review that was written
I am. And how could I not be? But maybe our listeners aren't all.
Right. So it's called The Belles Lettres Papers, and it's by Charles Simmons, and it came out in 1987. And I was actually sort of woefully unaware of this book, but I finally scored a used copy last week. And I just want to read you the first few lines of it because, Pamela, it seems like not a lot has changed, maybe. Here goes. As soon as I joined the staff, everyone wanted to know how it worked. Did we actually read all the books? How did we decide which ones to review? How did we pick the reviewers? Those were the innocent questions. People closer to the book business wanted to know whether we told reviewers what to say and whether we changed the reviews. People in the business didn't even ask. They assumed that a conspiracy existed to control opinion. I have to say that made me laugh.
That is sadly evergreen.
Then what really made me laugh is I thought, let me go into the archives and take a look at how we reviewed this book when it came out. So the review's from May 24th, 1987, and it has a genius headline, which is "Anyone We Know?" question mark. Which, I guess was really the only way they could play it, right?
Who was the person who wrote this book?
Charles Simmons? I don't know. And I have to admit that I'm a little unfamiliar with the staff of the book review as he's talking about it. So I planned to go back to Edwin Diamond's colossal, gossipy History of the Times to see if I could match up some of the real characters with the fictional ones.
I think we could also rustle up some old timers from the New York Times who have worked at the book review during that period. We'll investigate this.
We'll investigate and report back.
So tell us about the review of this book.
So the review is frankly a little mixed. I mean, mostly positive. Here's what they have to say. Lovers of literary quizzes will savor Mr. Simmons's wordplay. The characters have names like Folio. And when an editor is asked to examine an impenetrable review of Graham Greene's latest, he promises he'll get to the heart of the matter. Mr. Simmons has even composed 9 hilarious undiscovered Shakespeare sonnets, all of them shapelier and more Elizabethan than the travesty that some scholars allege to be the most recently unearthed Shakespearean work. However, then it goes on to say that it doesn't go quite deep enough, basically, that it's clear that he was holding back a little bit. And he said it might have made for sweet revenge, but it certainly would have juiced up this novel's tiny milieu.
I love the dismissive tiny milieu. Well, I have to say, as one of the members of that milieu, I'm eager to hear your full review of this on a future episode of What We're Reading.
I'll be back to do it, I promise.
All right, Tina, thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
This is John Williams. Benjamin Labatut joins me now from his home in Santiago, Chile. His book, When We Cease to Understand the World, fuses fact and fiction to turn the modern history of physics into a gripping narrative of obsessed scientists, world-changing discoveries, and the ultimate results, often quite dark, of our drive to understand the fundamental workings of the universe. It was shortlisted for this year's International Booker Prize and was recently named a finalist for the National Book Award in Translated Literature. It was translated by Adrian Nathan West. Benjamin, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Give people who aren't yet familiar with the book just a quick summary, and I know that's difficult, this is a complicated book, of what it's about and its general method of telling its story.
Well, I think the through line thing that goes throughout the entire book, the 4 stories that it has, is certain ideas and happenings that exceed our capacity for understanding. It has very different registers. It starts with an essay that is not chemically pure. That essay follows the story of a particular molecule, a poison, cyanide. It's followed by 2, I would call them short stories, but they're heavily documented. So there's this strange mixture of fact and fiction. And it's followed by a novella about the foundation of quantum mechanics. And it ends with a prose piece, semi-autobiographical. The book is trying to deal with these ideas that exceed our understanding, and that in some sense those ideas infected the form of the book and made it hang in a strange liminal space where fact and fiction sort of get blurred, because it's trying to look at these things that actually blur if you look at them closely.
They all deal with physics, and so we have a lot of real-life figures in here, including Albert Einstein and Erwin Schrödinger and Werner Heisenberg. And the book does start with that chapter about Fritz Haber, who was a scientist, and the development of gas as a weapon and its deployment during World War I, and also, I guess, during World War II. You write in a note at the end of the book that the fiction in that first piece is one paragraph. It's about a 25-page chapter, and it has one paragraph of invention in it, and the rest is very close to essentially nonfiction. And yet I have to say that section reads so grippingly and is written in a way that is very dramatic and feels, I suppose drama isn't unique to fiction, but it just feels very narratively driving. And I wonder what you got out of adding more and more fiction throughout the book, and what your inspiration was to do that, what you think it offers the following chapters.
Well, there's several reasons. Some of them are practical in the sense that there's a lot of available information regarding that first abyss. I consider each chapter dealing with some sort of void, and the first one deals with horror, the horror of war, and the links that we have between art and death, really. And there's a lot of available information there. There was no need for fiction. I like nonfiction. I write my texts, the first drafts of my texts are just clear cut nonfiction. But then when I get to the end, I sort of look at and I see there's a larger hidden meaning. The ideas in the first text are not complex at all. They're quite simple, I think. But it's just it relates to a certain time in history where things became unreal. It's very hard to understand what happened. The horror that ends in the concentration camps is really very hard to get a grips with. But then in the following texts, I deal with things that are so much more abstract. The first discovery of the black hole, certain ideas in mathematics that exceed our current comprehension, and madness. There's mathematics and madness in the third text. And also, when you come to the ideas of quantum mechanics, I simply found that there was no way to do justice to those stories and to make people have an intuitive, aesthetic feeling for what they mean, for how strange it really is, unless I used fiction. And there's a lot of, and as I say, there's also practical reasons for this. There's not much information at all about Schwarzschild's solving of Einstein's equations and the discovery of the black hole. There's not much available information about what Schrödinger was thinking, feeling when he came up with this equation that's changed the world, and that he himself died without understanding, and that nobody understands to this day. And it's drier as it goes along.
Let me stop you there to ask a question about that Schrodinger note you just made, which is that even he didn't understand it. But sometimes I think when people who, like me, I'm far from an expert. I haven't studied science since high school, but there is a sense of, well, if this genius didn't understand it, how do we know it's true? There are real life results from these theories, right? I mean, that's how we know that they work, even if we don't understand them on some other level.
Well, yeah, but what drew me towards Schrödinger in particular is one term in his equation, which is, we call it the wave function now. It's not that he didn't understand anything about it, that would be silly. The thing is that what the wave function says about the world is something that we still don't understand, and it's been 100 years. And that is it's a central human mystery. And that is what really drives my writing. What are these things that we can see about the world, but that we simply cannot comprehend? And that points straight to what is, to me, most wonderful about being alive, which is these things that we don't understand, because these things, they free us. They let us step out of the cage that rationality builds around us. And it points to, well, I think it's the closest one can come without having faith to the awe that one feels in the presence of God. It's a sort of mesmerizing aspect of science. So it's not, and that's also the reason why I use fiction, because I'm trying to point towards these stranger meanings, darker meanings, and it's the demon eye of fiction that can see them. You cannot stick to facts and give a true sense of how mysterious some ideas really are.
Yeah, especially in the centerpiece duet of sorts between Schrodinger and Heisenberg and their visions of the world. There's a conflict between the human desire for certainty and the universe's stubborn and vast refusal of it. And I think that's maybe that border that you get to where the most abstracted science that can't necessarily be tested yet in ways that we have at our disposal does meet a kind of faith. You have to have a faith that these principles are the way the universe operates.
I don't think we really need faith. I think we should just get along with the fact that we don't know. Richard Feynman has this wonderful little soundbite where he says, I'm not uncomfortable with not knowing. I think it's It's part of the wonder. It's very funny. I find it very curious that people don't seek out experiences that are beyond their understanding. I think we live, like Lovecraft said, in a placid island of ignorance. But the central thing, the thing that fiction does and that only fiction can do is provide meaning and purpose. Because the facts of reality are meaningless without a point of view. And that's why I use science, which is this particular point of view, to point to the stranger implications that science brings up. And by weaving fiction into the history of science, you can shine a light at these deeper associations. And I don't know. I mean, if science studies the speed of light, literature really studies the speed of shadow, the fault lines in the logic of our universe.
Well, you say that the facts are meaningless on their own, that you need a perspective through which to see them. And in the first half of the book, especially, I think there's a lot of implication that in fact, left to its own devices and in human hands, science has this very dark undercurrent, and that a lot of these developments that were made by these brilliant people were used to ends that they couldn't have been conscious of when they were studying the science.
I think that science and art have this unique place among human endeavors in that they enjoy a terrifying freedom. They really stand outside what we accept as moral. And it's fundamental that they keep that freedom because the truth is that without it, we probably would not have gotten here. If we only did what was right, if we only did what is moral, if we didn't have this fundamentally indifferent point of view, knowledge for its own sake, I don't think we would have ever gotten out of the caves. But the thing is, what I try to do is to show that science is not just a method. It's also, in some sense, a metaphysical delusion, an organized delusion that believes that the world corresponds to an order that we can actually know and understand. So I'm really trying to write about the subconscious of science, where the dreams of reason go to die a slow death.
You certainly do that. And there's a lot of beautiful writing in the book about these abstractions we've been discussing and these philosophical points. But I want to bring also people back to the characters in the book, because there's also the experience of reading it is not really an abstract one. It's very rooted in these people's experiences in these lives. And there are some, to use the old cliche of stranger than fiction, to go back to the black hole and Carl Schwarzschild. Talk a little bit about the scene in which Einstein gets this letter from Schwarzschild and where it was sent from and the fact that this actually happened. It seems so extraordinary.
Yes, it is. I heard it from Brian Greene during a talk he gave on string theory. It sounds unbelievable. There's this man who's a lieutenant in the army in the First World War, one of the premier scientists of his time. He shouldn't be fighting at the front, but he comes from Jewish descent and he was really nationalistic. He was proud of being German, so he volunteered to fight. And while he's in the trenches, I'll tell you the real story without the fiction. He suffers from a necrotizing disease of his skin, and he's dying there. He's dying, and he's in pain. His body's covered in blisters, and he gets these papers that Einstein published a couple of months before, and he provides the first exact solution to Einstein's field equations of general relativity. These equations are so complex that Einstein himself gave approximate answers, and he thought that he would die without ever seeing an exact one. And Carl Schwarzschild was an astronomer, a mathematical genius. He was highly admired by his peers, and he chooses a set of coordinates. He basically chooses a scenario where he gets an exact answer. He sends it back to Einstein, and then he dies. He dies, and he dies without knowing that he's actually touched. It's the first time that a human mind has touched the black hole, because the black hole springs out of his solution. And it took years for someone, and it was Oppenheimer in 1939, the same day, I believe, same week, when the Nazi tanks crossed the border and start the Second World War of Poland, that they published a paper saying this is inevitable. This black hole that Schwarzschild saw and that he died without knowing is inevitable. It doesn't matter what Einstein says. And the funny thing about it, the solution both negates the equations because it creates conditions where the equations break down, And it also props it up because it says, look, this is an actual metric that you can use and then that you can work with. And that is what brought me in.
When you say that's what brought you in, was that the first kernel of the book, that story?
No, these things sort of, they all went in parallel. I have certain obsessions now, and I follow those obsessions. So I keep bumping into these. But I think it's an important thing for me is what you said before. I like stories which are incarnate, where ideas sort of become flesh. I like the moments where a strange wisdom or madness come into the world through somebody's actual flesh and body. I like to say that I write about physicists, but I like to write about physicists who have sex and masturbate and shit their pants.
Let's talk about one of them, because some of them are very big names, like I said, and some, at least to non-experts like myself, will be less well known. So I want to ask about one in particular, this French physicist named Louis de Broglie, and tell me a bit about his contributions to the science, but more importantly, what you as a fiction writer found interesting about him and bringing him to life.
Well, he's a beautiful character. He's a Count Louis de Broglie. So he had this brother who was a renowned experimental physicist, and he grew up helping his brother drill holes into the walls of their massive French mansions in Paris to put cables through the walls, through the tapestry. He was very shy. He was very mild mannered, and then he got drafted into the First World War, and he spent most of it in the Eiffel Tower, being a radio operator. He was an absolute coward. He was very mild mannered, very soft man. Well, his contribution is basically saying that Einstein had proven before him that light had this duality where it behaved like a wave and a particle. And De Broglie basically says, well, if light has this duality, then so should regular matter. And that at the time made absolutely no sense. It still doesn't really make sense if you think about it. But he made this contribution, which was heralded as a great breakthrough. But then it got a lot of pushback because we have this other team of scientists from Copenhagen, which I absolutely adore because they couldn't be darker. They just kept saying, no, look, this is stranger still. We can't just treat this as a well known area of physics. It's stranger still. It's more abstract. We really have to break these metaphors apart if we're going to get anywhere. And they managed to do so. And they managed to create a massive amount of confusion. And these arguments are still raging.
There's this incredible scene in the book, and so I have to ask if it's there are these lines where you come to in the book where you're obviously very curious about the line between fiction and nonfiction, which is just one small part of its appeal. So there's this one extended scene where De Broglie sort of locks himself into his room working on these theories, and people are worried about him and figure that he's, they're going to walk in and find him in a corner somewhere malnourished. And when they finally do go in, he's sitting in there. It says, clad in a velvet suit, mustache, and hair recently trimmed, smoking a thin cigarette with an immense smile across his face and his eyes beaming as they had when he was a child. Maurice, De Broglie said, handing him a bundle of papers, as naturally as if they had spent the afternoon together, I need you to tell me if I've lost my mind.
I'm glad you liked that paragraph because it was so hard to write, that entire scene. It's preceded by his brother walking through a show of art brut. Because when I was researching, I found that Jean Dubuffet, this French artist known for his collection of art brut, had also spent part of the war in the Eiffel Tower. So I connected that.
Define art brut for people.
It's rescuing the visions of mad men, mad women, children, people who lived on the streets. It's the idea that from madness, from our unconscious, we can sort of harvest this wonderful creative energy, which is, I think it's, you can see the influence of that idea in a lot of the art of the past century. I'm sorry to say that scene is fiction. Again, no, what I'm trying to do is for people to understand just how mad these ideas seemed at the time to the very people who discovered them. And I had to use these characters for people to get a sense of how brutal the beauty was that these men were seeing for the first time.
You talked about having obsessions, and should I assume that you've been a lifelong reader of science and interested in it? Is that one of them?
My main obsession is, I guess I would say I'm interested in foundations. I'm interested in what lies in. I'm interested in the dark underbelly of things. And science is one of the, I can't think of any other activity, modern activity that delves so deeply and that is always interested in, well, what's behind this and then what's behind that. So yeah, I put myself through a couple of things in that quest. I just find that science is absolutely inspiring because it never stops. It continues to expand until what it discovers becomes sort of unimaginable. And it's also, I think it's from a certain perspective, a particular form of insanity. But I'm more interested in literature because literature is not tied to a set idea of the truth. Its scope, its power is almost non existent nowadays, but the scope encompasses all of our inner worlds, our imagination, the horror. And in that sense, it's like a older sister of science. It just doesn't have any teeth yet. It doesn't have the bite that it used to. But it lets us study and consider every single aspect of the human imagination, not just those that have a correspondence with reality.
A lot of the fiction is you get into these people's dreams and fantasies, and there are many fantastical elements in the book as it progresses. There's a coda which comes after the epilogue, which I found very interesting, called The Night Gardener. And it's, like you said, it's a first person narrated short piece about a person, a man, I assumed, but I don't know, in the mountains, walking with his dog and meeting a man gardening at night and talking to him about science. And without going into too much of the details of it, because I actually think that it's a very interesting thing to sort of come upon after you're done reading the book, is that a kind of origin story for the book placed at the end, or is it completely imaginative? Or is it wrong to even ask that question?
Oh, I don't mind answering. Well, the fundamental truth of that piece is that I'm the night gardener. It's a joke between me and my wife. I get obsessed with gardening at certain times of the year, and she would wake up and I'd be gardening at night, and she says, "You look like a madman. What are the neighbors gonna think? Why are you digging holes in the garden at night?" There's so much about this book that was not planned. I wrote that piece because I don't like to speak in public. So I wrote the piece to present the book, to read it out loud if it was going to be a launch. And then this strange line came into my head a couple of months before the pandemic started. And it said, and it started speaking about a vegetable plague that was spreading from tree to tree. I think I was probably rereading Sebald at the time. And I just liked the register and the idea of this hidden plague that was rising up from the natural world. And then when the pandemic hit, I was actually quite taken aback. But I think that's one of the things that only art and literature can do, which is that you sort of you become haunted by what you're studying, and certain strange things sort of trickle back. I have no rational explanation for that at all.
The book's original title in Spanish translates in English as A Terrible Verdure, which puts terrible in front of a word we associate with thriving vegetation and health. So it's kind of jarring, and the phrase appears at the end of the book's first chapter. Why that title for the book in its original Spanish, and what does it tell us about the book that the new title might not?
To me, that is one of the main things that I try to write about. I try to write texts that show this fundamental ambiguity, this duality that we have to live with. I spend a lot of time in the woods. I spend a lot of time in the garden. And if you look deeply into nature, you get a deeper understanding of how the cruelty that we see in human beings is also there in the natural world. There's a fundamental indifference, there's a hunger in nature. It has an aspect that is really profoundly terrifying to interact with, and that we have forgotten because we're destroying everything. So a terrible verdure, un verdor terrible, has to do with this idea that there's a almost obscene impulse that is hardwired into living things to grow, to expand. This is something that I think everybody knows it, but we all turn a blind eye to the fact that life feeds on death. It's unavoidable. That image of a terrible verdure tries to speak directly to that. And the entire book deals with that. We would like things to be simpler and more clean cut, but they're not. They're simply not.
They're wild and they're overgrowing.
Exactly.
Benjamin, this is such a unique book. And so I know that this can be touchy for writers, but I feel compelled to ask you what you might be working on next, just because it's so hard to envision what a logical next step would be.
Well, I'm writing about intelligence. I'm writing about the human being that I consider to be the smartest person who lived during the 20th century. And I'm writing about the way that I think he will inevitably come back into the world right now. I think he's coming back. So it has a lot to do with mathematics. It has to do with the dawning of new ways of thought and the madness and a new madness as well. But I think we sort of feel it's coming up. I think people are feeling it underneath their feet.
Well, I will leave the mystery of who that is and how they will come back to myself and other readers.
I wouldn't tell you, John. Don't worry.
Benjamin Labatut's book is When We Cease to Understand the World, which in less than 200 pages packs in quite a lot of scientific history and imaginative writing. Benjamin, thank you again for discussing it with me.
Thank you so much, John.
Liz Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So this week we had a story written by Katie Rossman and myself about Scholastic, which is the 100-year-old publisher behind books like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games and The Babysitter's Club. So the company's chairman and CEO, Dick Robinson, died this summer at 84 years old. And he left behind a succession plan that seems to have surprised many of the key players, including the woman to whom he left control of the company, whose name is Yole Lucchese. Miss Lucchese is a longtime executive at Scholastic. She has been there for 30 years and is in charge of the company's strategy and media ventures, which basically means bringing its characters to screens. So there's like a Clifford movie coming out soon that she was very involved in, and a TV show based on the Magic School Bus, which my kids really enjoy. But in a story in the Wall Street Journal that ran shortly after she inherited Mr. Robinson's Class A stock, which is the thing that gives her control of the company, the story said the two of them were not just colleagues, but also longtime romantic partners. And several former employees confirmed to us that their personal relationship was well known among many people at Scholastic. Dick Robinson's request to her skips over his two sons, who are in their 20s and 30s and have not been involved in the company. So this saga has been interesting in terms of who knew what when, and the answer to that seems to be a lot of key people didn't know much until after he died, which is really unusual for a public company. But it's also interesting in terms of what it means for the future of Scholastic. Like you and I have talked a lot on the podcast about how much consolidation is happening in publishing. Hachette recently bought Workman, and Penguin Random House is in the process of trying to buy Simon & Schuster, which, if it's approved by federal regulators, would create this colossus that's much bigger than every other publisher in the country. And if that goes through, it'll only increase the pressure on other publishing houses to get bigger. And one thing they'll be looking for is a big backlist. And a backlist is older titles that a publisher has, which create like a reliable stream of revenue. Because unlike new books, which are unpredictable, you know how well the old books are going to sell. So if a company has, for example, a backlist that includes Harry Potter, that would be very appealing. So Scholastic is going to be a really attractive acquisition target. But Dick Robinson made no secret of the fact that he didn't want Scholastic to be sold. And in that regard, so far anyway, he seems to have gotten what he wanted, because Yole Lucchese and the new Scholastic CEO, Peter Warwick, they don't seem to want to sell. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
So no longer necessarily a family-controlled business, but perhaps still independent.
For now.
All right, Liz, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Gall Beckerman and Lauren Christensen. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, Gall, let's start with you. What have you been reading these days?
So I just finished a book by A.L. Press. I think it's his third book. It's called Dirty Work, Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. And Press sets up the premise of his book in an interesting way. So I'll just describe it for a minute and then tell you a little bit about the book. He talks about a sociologist who goes to Germany in the years after World War II and has a conversation with a German architect who, describes with some sort of guilt feeling what had happened during the Holocaust, what had happened to Jews. But then as he sort of draws him out into the conversation, in this conversation, the architect begins to say, well, there was really a problem. I mean, Jews were really a problem in our society. They were taking all the good jobs. This was a situation that needed to be solved somehow. And the sociologist kind of walked away with this conversation and spun out of it. The sociologist's name was Everett Hughes, I should mention, spun out of it a concept called dirty work, which is that, this German architect kind of felt that he is one with the good people, but there are certain situations in society that need to be taken care of. And there are the people who do the quote unquote dirty work. And Press took this idea and used it to look at our own society and the people who do the jobs that have some kind of moral compromise involved in them that we don't think about, that exists sort of in the shadows. And the book is broken up into 3 parts. It's very deeply reported. The first is he's looking at people with mental illness who are in prisons as a society, that people who have terrible mental illnesses end up being either on the street or they end up in prison. And so he's still looking at the people who kind of handle people with mental illnesses in prison. The next section is looking at people who are drone operators, so people who are sitting in bureaucratic offices and conducting war in Afghanistan and Pakistan remotely. And then the last section are people who are on the kill floors of factories that produce meat. And so in all of these situations, he goes in with a great deal of empathy, like trying to understand who these people are who have taken on these jobs and really explained the kind of bind that they've found themselves in. A lot of these are, people who didn't have any other work that they could take on, and they're forced every day to sort of confront the moral quandaries involved in their work. And I think what he does is he brings this kind of other understanding of inequality. It's like another dimension to inequality, which is that we need these people to do these jobs for us. The rest of society needs people to do these jobs for us, but we don't think about them, and they often feel like they don't have a choice. And ultimately, he's not really looking for solutions in this book. It's more that he just wants us to see them. And he wants to see the kind of hidden costs that they bear, the people who are in the shadows doing our bidding and suffering for it.
Does he effectively tie these 3 very different occupations together? Does it feel like his overarching thesis works and that the book feels like a coherent whole, or does it kind of feel like a book in 3 parts?
No, I think it does. I mean, look, it is a little bit tenuous bringing together these 3 different examples, but he has concepts like, he talks in the chapter on drone warfare, he talks about moral injury, which is not something that we've ever, we think about like PTSD and sort of the physical, psychological response to being in war. But he brings in this idea that apparently is growing in prevalence in people's thinking of moral injury. And it sort of ties together these 3 examples because in all instances, people see things and are forced to do things that it's some part of their brain they know is wrong, and they have to do it anyway. They have to follow orders. The person working with mental patients in a prison who sees guards treating those people roughly and can't really say anything about it. The person who's engaged in drone warfare and who has to shoot somebody and not think about the collateral damage involved. The person who's on the factory floor and seeing the state of, how the animals are treated. So they all are suffering this kind of moral injury or having to kind of confront it.
Gal, everything you're describing is really making me think of the book that I have been reading in a new way. I've been reading Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott, and it grew out of a 2013 series of articles in the newspaper. I'm not finished with it yet. It's a very long book, but I'm at this point or shortly after a family of 8 children and a mother and father have been forcibly separated into multiple foster homes, and ACS, so the Administration for Children's Services in New York, I think would be a really great chapter for Press on dirty work. I mean, these government employees who are forced to separate families and the system around them that forces their hand when, individuals doing that work may or may not feel extreme tortured guilt at actually separating these families. So let me back up. So this book, it grew out of a 2013 magazine piece she did for the Times Magazine. And it follows one family. As I mentioned, the oldest child of 8 is a girl named Dasani, who is a spectacularly gifted child. And a word that's used throughout the book is parentified. She, as the oldest daughter and as the extremely capable daughter, she is really relied upon by her parents, who are, variously abusing substances, who are having a hard time holding down jobs, and who are in and out, mostly in homeless shelters. She really is relied upon to take care of the kids. And so Elliot, the author, follows this family with such a granular detail that you wonder if the author, if Elliot too was living in the family's, way too tiny homes. Sometimes they share a single room in a shelter. It seems like Elliot is, sharing their beds as they scream for their mothers late at night, or the train rides around the city's boroughs collecting like food stamps and hustling. I think the mother shoplifts birthday cakes from Target to give the kids on their birthdays. It's this really complicated moral inquiry, right? I mean, it's my opinion that these parents come off as incredibly wholehearted. And of course, every person has flaws, but I think Elliot really gets at the heart of how difficult it is to be a parent, especially to 8 children in a city that is prohibitively expensive. Much of the book takes place in Bed-Stuy and Fort Greene in Brooklyn, neighborhoods that are either gentrified or on their way to being gentrified. And you see just the extreme poverty of these people who've been placed out by increasingly white, increasingly wealthy demographics in these formerly redlined neighborhoods. So Elliot really just knows when to zoom out on this story, the family story, giving us the context of the city's failing, often really corrupt child services programs, social services, policing programs under various administrations. The story spans from Giuliani's administration to Bloomberg to de Blasio, and also for this country's really racist past that has just been designed and perpetuated to keep Black people poor and hungry and ignored. And if alive. And it's a story that obviously many New Yorkers, many Americans know in the abstract, but short of experiencing it yourself, I really do think the next best option is to read their voices and their plights as up close as Eliot takes us. And it also just really makes me think about the work of journalists overall. I think Eliot's project is extremely immersive. It's similar to the really deep ethnography, Gal, that you were saying Press does. But you can really feel Eliot's heart, without it compromising the integrity of the reporting. And I think so much of journalism, you learn overall to just be totally impartial, to come at a story without real opinions. And of course, it's a nice ideal, and it serves in many contexts, right? There's a time and a place, but at the end of the day, we are, human beings, and I think, Eliot is really able to strike that balance between a kind of standing in the doorway, somewhat objective observer. And then sometimes she has to acknowledge, like, these kids called me when their parents' cell phones were shut off and they were having a crisis, or these kids are writing these 7-page letters about what it was like to be separated from each other. And so it's just a nice reminder that the work of journalism is done by human beings. Shocker.
I went into this book a bit with my guard up precisely for the reasons that you're describing. Like, how close is she to this subject? How is her presence there affecting the story? But Eliot herself seems so self-aware of this position that she has, and how she needs to call it out occasionally and make us aware as the readers that this is what's happening. And I think that the zooming out that you're describing, the kind of attempt to look at the bigger structural issues that underlay everything that's going on in this family's life, really sort of moves it into something else.
Pamela, what are you reading?
All right, I'm going to lighten it up here with Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? A book that is in the news because Rooney recently made a statement that she would not allow an Israeli publisher to publish the Hebrew translation of this book, though she was open to a Hebrew translation. And her previous 2 books were translated into Hebrew, so there's a lot of controversy around that. And I will put that aside and talk about the book as much as I'm excited to dig into that with all of you. Yeah, I mean, Gal, interested? I welcome either of you to jump in on that front. And the silence. All right, so let's talk about the book. And I know you both have opinions. Lauren, you're a huge fan. Gal, I can't remember where you stand.
I'm sort of in the middle, I think.
Okay. That's a very gentle way of saying you hate it. No, I'm kidding. It's, but I know that you both have thoughts on this book, and I had not read a Rooney novel before this. I can now come out with it. It feels like a dereliction on the part of someone with my job not to read one of the biggest names. So I finally did my work. And I did it actually after talking to Brendan Taylor on this podcast, who persuaded me to give this book a shot. Previously, I'd only read a few pages, maybe 30 pages of conversations with friends before giving my copy to our colleague, Greg Coles. So I wasn't inclined to read this because I felt with that book like the stakes were very low. And I guess the stakes might feel low following the conversation each of you had about very weighty and meaningful issues, economic and social, political issues. Sally Rooney is about two relationships. It's actually about more relationships than that, but it's about two couples and friendships between the members of these two couples. And what can I say? Let's start with what I can say that is good, which is I think that she really does have a distinctive and original and smart voice. I mean, she has a style, and there's not a lot of writers writing fiction right now where I feel like, wow, this person's really kind of struck out in a new way. So I think that's what I appreciated the most about her. She's young and of a different generation, but I think she has a kind of old soul, and she has a real appreciation for language, and she writes in an almost stately fashion about very millennial things. So she'll say, the photograph got 163 likes, rather than to say like the image got or the picture got or the photo got. There's an almost studied formality to a lot of her language that she applies to situations that are informal. Like she'll write about sex, but she'll write about it in that same kind of stately fashion. I think she really gets at a generation. Since you're part of that generation, Lauren, maybe you can speak to a little bit more about how well she captures that kind of mindset, mood, angst, whatever you might want to call it.
I struggle to see this as a millennial novel. I don't really agree that the stakes are low really in any of her work. And I know you said they're higher here than in Conversations, but still I think this is very much a novel about novel writing. I think that's what's at stake in this book. It's a really studied inquiry into the ethics of writing fiction when the entire world is falling apart around you. And yes, it's about two couples and love and friendship and falling in and out of these deep relationships. And isn't that what all of our lives are about? And I think that's a very human project, a very literary project. I did have the opportunity to speak with Sally about her process, and it was such a rigorously researched approach that she took. She really just buried her head in the New York Public Library on a fellowship for several months and did what the writer does, which is just sit with herself and think about, okay, I've written these two novels. I'm a very famous novelist, famous in our world. But what is it that I'm doing? Why am I writing these books? If I know about all these problems, Sally Rooney is, especially as you mentioned earlier, Pamela, she is very politically minded. So why isn't she going out and solving these problems? Why is she writing books about people falling in love? Well, because it's what we all care about. At the end of the day, we can care about both things. And I think that's a really important and just beautiful thing that she's doing. So you asked about the generational thing. I mean, I don't know. This book feels like I don't know how you're gonna feel about this, but it feels like Middlemarch to me. It feels like, it's divided between these passages about the two relationships, right? The loves that are building and the friendships. And then it kind of breaks into these really lengthy email passages that are really just kind of expositions of like historical analysis and theory. And it felt like an old 19th century book that is, kind of serialized, like political and personal books kind of blended together into this amalgam of like what our lives kind of look like. But so that's my response is I don't think it's a millennial novel.
Well, there's a cynical interpretation though of that back and forth, which is, we are totally drawn in to the love stories, and that's the thing that pulls us along. And essentially this is a book about these relationships and we want to see where they go. But then there's those email passages are like her allowing herself to do the kind of intellectual work that she wants these novels to do, kind of having her cake and eating it too. You know, like
Right. She's secretly an essayist.
yeah. And I had some problems with those emails. I felt like I didn't know if to read them earnestly or if to read them kind of ironically as something that was produced by these characters as characters, or was it Sally Rooney, who was telling us sort of what goes on in her mind when it comes to capitalism. I didn't really know necessarily always how to read them. That said, I really enjoyed the book. So so that's always the conundrum with Sally Rooney. Even when you are arguing with it, you can't really put it down.
Well, two quick things I want to say. One is that our colleague John Williams is about to start reading Middlemarch. So we will task him with making a comparison between the two. I failed to persuade him to read Daniel Deronda first.
Daniel Deronda, I find him much more accessible towards Elliot than
yes,
Middlemarch.
That's why it works for me, Lauren. That's the level I
No,
operate
me
at.
too.
No.
Me too. I'm saying it's something to begin with. Okay.
That or Ethan Frome, assigned to every, ninth grader, at least in the 80s and 70s, which I think is a terrible mistake, but that's another subject. The other thing, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier conversation, and I have to mention it on the podcast just because I'm hoping that some listener out there will see this analogy and be like, yes, I was thinking exactly the same thing, or maybe it's just me. But the narrative voice in this book really reminds me of the voiceover narration in Jules and Jim. So at risk of sounding totally pretentious and off base, I don't know, there's something about it. I want to hear from one other listener, please, who agrees with me, because I can tell by your laughter, Gal and Lauren, that you think I'm insane.
I don't speak French.
It's almost like this. There's something almost like stage direction-y about it.
Yes,
it's like alienating.
She just wrote a
you.
TV show,
right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's what's happening here. But it almost is like purposely alienating you from the action. It's like let's put your arm up. Yeah, exactly.
We should do a Sally Rooney style debate about this book.
I mean, that's why I think, to that distancing, I think that's why you were wondering is this an earnest or is this irony? Is there a detachment here? There's certain things where it's like you're not fully persuaded. And the one other thing I'll bring up, and I'm eager to hear what either of you think of this, is, her character in the book, what I guess I think of as the Sally Rooney figure, Alice, because of course she is a novelist in the book, just keeps being described as unlikable or alienating people or being argumentative or off-putting. And I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. Was that Sally Rooney commenting on how she thinks people perceive her to be? Was that meant to be accurate? What did you two think?
So I think it was a reaction to the idea, throughout the book, that Alice, who is this really famous twice novelist who has so much money now, she doesn't know what to do with it, really resents this cult of authorship that has been built around her without her consent. And I mean, I'm hesitant, and as is Rooney, to speak of her fame as actual fame, because obviously we all have to be aware that
it's literary fiction fame.
Right. Yeah. In our world, she's pretty much Michael Jordan. But that fame, unlike Michael Jordan or unlike, an actor whose work necessitates the spotlight, that writing is actually really the opposite, that it's a lot of people go into it expecting it to involve a lot of solitary time, right? Just being alone with your computer, which is distinguished from film writing or something like that. And so Rooney really struggling with this idea that suddenly people like me are showing up to meet her and ask her questions and photograph her and write about her and not just the work. And, her question being, well, if my personality sucks, what does that have to do with my work? And I think it's a great question. I think it is just part of this architecture that we build around it so that other people can profit off of her work. This kind of voyeurism that is really profitable in our industry. And, it's not the biggest problem that she sees in contemporary society. She's not saying that, but it is just something worth questioning.
And that's capitalism. All right.
I've explained it.
Let's go through the books again. Gal?
I was reading Dirty Work by A.L. Press.
I am reading Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott.
And I read Sally Rooney, Beautiful World, Where Are You? Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.